Storytelling and Beyond brings you a deeply emotional, heartwarming tale. In this story, a simple act of kindness between a plumber and a struggling widow transforms their lives in ways they never imagined. Join us on this journey of compassion, unexpected connection, and the power of human kindness. Margaret sat at her small wooden table, the yellowish light of the kitchen lamp flickering faintly as it fought against the gathering gloom of an impending storm. The sound of the wind outside howling through the cracks of her weathered house was nothing compared to the deafening drip 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 of water coming from the kitchen sink. The leak had started 2 days ago, just a small drop here and there, but now it was relentless, pounding, persistent, like an unwanted reminder of everything she couldn't fix. At 62 years old, Margaret had learned to live with what life had handed her. The death of her husband 3 years ago had stripped away the foundation of her life, leaving her with the mortgage, bills, and responsibilities that never seemed to stop. She had buried herself in her memories, her late husband's laugh, the warmth of their love, the way they used to sit in this very kitchen drinking coffee together, talking about their dreams. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else. Margaret felt as if she were now a ghost in her own life, going through the motions without ever truly being present. Each day was another lonely battle of survival. Every moment was a reminder of the love she had lost, and now, the house that had once been filled with warmth now echoed with emptiness. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:30 p.m. It was nearly time for her to leave for her part-time job at the small local store, another small lifeline she clung to. But the leak wouldn't wait, and neither would the bill she'd put off paying for too long. It had been days since she called the plumber, but he had promised to come by. She wondered if he'd show up. Just as she put down her cup of lukewarm coffee, a soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. Margaret stood up, her knees creaking with the effort. As she opened the door, she was met with a tall figure holding a toolbox, drenched from the rain that had started to fall in sheets. His clothes were soaked, his face tired but kind. "You must be Margaret," he said with a gentle smile, his voice warm despite the rain. "I'm Sam. I got your call about the leak." Margaret nodded, stepping aside to let him in. As he entered, he gave the house a quick look around. It wasn't much: old carpets, worn-out furniture, and the faint smell of dust in the air, but Sam didn't seem to mind. To him, it was just another job. But for Margaret, it felt like an invasion. She hadn't let anyone into her personal space for months, maybe even longer. She had learned to keep people at arm's length, afraid of the judgment in their eyes, afraid that they might see how much she had lost. "I've got a towel in the bathroom, if you need it," Margaret said, awkwardly. "And there's a cup of coffee on the counter if you'd like some." Sam smiled again, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'm good for now, thank you. Let's get this pipe fixed, and then we'll see about that coffee, yeah?" Margaret led him to the kitchen, where the drip of water from the sink seemed to grow louder in the silence of the room. Sam crouched down beside the sink, inspecting the pipe under the cabinet. Margaret stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say. Her usual habit was to keep conversations to a minimum. Small talk had always felt awkward, especially now, when every conversation felt like an uncomfortable reminder of what she didn't have. But Sam didn't seem bothered. He worked quietly for a few moments before glancing up. "I'm going to need to shut the water off to fix this properly. I'll be just a second." As he walked toward the basement, Margaret couldn't help but feel a twinge of embarrassment. Here she was alone in her home, relying on a stranger to fix what should have been a simple task, while the world continued on around her. She had always been independent, always taken care of things on her own. But now, it seemed that everything was beyond her control. Sam returned a few moments later, and as he worked on the pipe, he asked, "So, how long have you been living here?" Margaret hesitated. Most people didn't ask questions like that. Most people didn't care about her past, her story. They just needed the job done. But something about Sam made her feel like he actually wanted to know, wanted to see her beyond the walls of her home, beyond the silence. "A little over 30 years, Margaret replied softly. "My husband and I bought this place when we were young. It's where we built our life." She stopped herself, realizing she had said more than she intended. Sam didn't seem uncomfortable. Instead, he nodded and kept working, his movements steady and assured. Sounds like a good place for memories. The simplicity of his words hit Margaret harder than she expected. She felt a lump form in her throat as she tried to swallow it down. Memories were all she had left, and sometimes, they were almost too much to bear. She wanted to say something more, but instead, she turned her back and busied herself with the kitchen counter, wiping down already clean dishes. For a few moments, the sound of the dripping pipe and Sam's work were the only sounds in the room. But then, Sam broke the silence once again. "You know," he said casually, "I've been doing plumbing for over 10 years now. I've worked on a lot of houses, fixed a lot of leaks. But I can tell you that there's something special about old houses. They've got history in them. Every crack, every creak tells a story. Like this one, I'm sure." Margaret paused, looking over at him. His face was still focused on the pipe, but there was an empathy in his eyes that made her feel like he truly understood something. "I'm not so sure there's much left to tell," she said, her voice quieter than before. "A lot of the stories are gone now." Sam didn't answer immediately. He just finished tightening the last part of the pipe, then turned to look at her. There was a sincerity in his expression that made Margaret feel as if he were looking directly at her heart, as if he could see beyond the weathered walls of her house and into the depths of her soul. "I think you're wrong," he said gently. "I think every house still has a story. And every story still matters." His words hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a small shift inside her, a spark of hope she hadn't realized she still held. Maybe there was more to her life than she had allowed herself to believe. Maybe there were still stories left to be written, still moments left to be lived. As Sam finished up the repairs, he handed her the bill. Margaret hesitated, but before she could even reach for her purse, Sam shook his head. "Don't worry about it," he said. "It's on the house." Margaret blinked in surprise, not sure how to respond. "But you've worked hard. You deserve to be paid." Sam smiled again, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "Some things in life can't be paid for with money." As Margaret watched him leave, she stood for a moment in the doorway, still processing what had just happened. A simple act of kindness, one person giving freely without expectation, had changed the way she saw the world, even if just for a moment. She felt the tightness in her chest loosen, just a little. For the first time in months, she felt something other than loneliness. She felt seen. It was a small thing, but for Margaret, it was enough. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky that was an almost surreal shade of blue. The sun, though still hidden behind the last remnants of clouds, cast a soft glow across the small house. Margaret, who had spent most of the night thinking about Sam's words, stood by the kitchen window, looking out over the quiet street. The silence was welcome, almost comforting, but there was an underlying feeling in her chest, something that felt unfamiliar. It wasn't the usual weight of grief or loneliness that had become so familiar to her. This was different, a stirring of something that had lain dormant for too long. She hadn't expected Sam to be the one to leave such an impact. He was just a plumber, after all. But something about the way he had spoken, the kindness in his eyes, it stayed with her. It was as if he had glimpsed a part of her life, her pain, and decided not to turn away. As she went about her morning routine, making a pot of tea and tidying up the house, her thoughts kept returning to him. The truth was, Margaret had spent so long pushing people away, avoiding anything that might stir her emotions, that she had forgotten what it felt like to connect with someone, to truly see them and be seen in return. But today was different. It was as if the air itself was filled with a quiet promise, urging her to move beyond the walls she had built around herself. The knock on the door startled her. She had been lost in thought, and the sound pulled her out of her reverie. Her first instinct was to ignore it. After all, she wasn't expecting anyone, and she certainly wasn't in the mood for company. But as she hesitated, another knock followed, this one a little more insistent. Margaret walked slowly toward the door, feeling the nervous flutter in her stomach. She opened it cautiously, unsure of who could be there. Standing before her was Sam, holding a small potted plant. His hair was still damp from the rain, but there was something different about him today. The tiredness she had noticed before seemed to be replaced by something else, something lighter. He smiled at her, holding out the plant. "I thought you could use this," he said simply, his voice warm. "I know it's not much, but I thought it might brighten up your kitchen a bit." Margaret blinked, momentarily speechless. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple potted plant, but it felt like the most thoughtful gift she had received in years. She hadn't expected anything from him. He had already done more than enough by fixing her sink and giving her his time. But this was something entirely different. She took the plant, her hands trembling slightly as she held it. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice soft. Sam shrugged, his smile still gentle. "It's just a plant, Margaret. I thought it might help make the place feel a little more alive." For a moment, they both stood there, unsure of what to say next. The weight of the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was as if the air itself had shifted, an unspoken understanding hanging between them. Margaret stepped aside, allowing him to come in. She placed the plant on the kitchen counter, the bright green leaves a stark contrast against the drab interior. It was a simple thing, but it made the room seem warmer somehow. "Do you have time for a cup of tea?" Margaret asked, her voice hesitant but genuine. She hadn't invited anyone into her home in months, but something about Sam's presence made her feel like it was okay. He wasn't here to judge or to pity her, he was just there. "I'd love some," Sam replied, nodding as he sat at the kitchen table. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the worn-out furniture and the quiet stillness of the space. It wasn't a judgmental look, it was more of a curious one, as if he were trying to understand her, not just the house. As Margaret made the tea, she felt a strange sense of vulnerability wash over her. For the first time in a long while, she realized that she was letting someone in, not just into her home, but into her life. She felt her walls slowly crumbling, and for a brief moment, she didn't feel so alone. She brought the steaming cups to the table and sat across from Sam. The conversation flowed easily between them, more natural than Margaret had expected. They talked about everything and nothing: Sam's work as a plumber, the small things in life, the strange weather, and even a little about their pasts. Margaret told him about her husband, about how they had built their life together in this house, and how everything had changed when he passed away. It was the first time she had spoken about him in months, and the words seemed to come more easily than she had expected. "I'm sorry for your loss," Sam said quietly, his voice sincere. Margaret smiled faintly, the sadness in her eyes softened by his empathy. "Thank you. It's been hard, but you learn to carry on." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation lingering between them. But there was no awkwardness in the air, only a quiet understanding, a recognition that they had both experienced pain, though in different ways. Margaret realized that, in this brief encounter, she had found something she had thought lost forever: a connection. It wasn't anything grand, no great gesture or sweeping declaration, but it was real. And it was enough. As the conversation continued, Margaret began to feel a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. Maybe it was Sam's kindness, or maybe it was the simple realization that life didn't have to be faced alone. For the first time in years, she felt like she could begin to move forward, not because everything was fixed, but because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't carrying the burden of grief alone. When Sam stood to leave, he smiled once more, his eyes kind. "Take care, Margaret. I'll see you around." Margaret nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate the plant. And the company." "You're welcome," he said, giving her one last smile before he stepped out the door. As she closed the door behind him, Margaret stood for a moment, letting the stillness of the house wash over her. It wasn't empty anymore, not completely. There was something new in the air, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a loud, dramatic change, but it was there, in the quiet moments, in the small gestures of kindness that had come her way. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The following week passed in a quiet blur. The change that Margaret had felt that day Sam had brought the plant lingered, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. It was as if the small act of kindness had begun a slow process inside her, one that she hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. It wasn't as though she suddenly had everything figured out or that the grief had vanished, but there was a lightness in the air around her, something that had been missing for far too long. Margaret tried to keep up her usual routine, pushing through the days. She kept to herself, not reaching out to anyone, unwilling to risk the discomfort of vulnerability. But every now and then, the thought of Sam would slip into her mind, like an unexpected whisper. What was it about him that had made such an impression? Why had she let him in when she had refused to let anyone get close for so long? One afternoon, Margaret was sitting at her kitchen table, sorting through some old papers, when she heard the familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway. She glanced out the window, expecting to see the neighbor's car, but instead, it was Sam's van. Her heart skipped a beat, though she couldn't quite explain why. It was as if his arrival had stirred something inside her, a part of her that hadn't realized it missed connection. She rose from the table and opened the door before she could overthink it. "Sam? Everything okay?" she asked, stepping outside. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to ask, but the words came out before she could stop them. Sam smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling in that familiar way. "Actually, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by," he said. "I figured I'd check in, see if everything's still working well with the sink, and, well, I thought maybe you'd like some company." Margaret blinked, surprised by the offer. She hadn't realized how much she missed company until the simple gesture had caught her off guard. It wasn't just that Sam was offering to check on the sink again, he was offering his time, his presence. She felt the walls she had spent years building slowly begin to crumble again. Margaret hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I'm fine. Everything's fine with the sink. But, well, sure, come in. Tea?" Sam nodded and followed her inside, taking a seat at the same kitchen table where they had shared tea the last time. It wasn't a grand reunion or a moment of dramatic reconciliation, but something about the calmness of it felt right. As she prepared the tea, Margaret found herself reflecting on the changes she had started to notice. She wasn't used to letting people in, but Sam's presence made her feel like she wasn't so alone. Stepped outside, leaving Margaret standing in the doorway, watching him walk to his van. As the door closed softly behind her, she stood still for a moment, letting the peace of the afternoon wash over her. The house wasn't as quiet anymore. There was a presence in it now, a presence that made the grief, though still there, feel more bearable. Maybe this was what she needed all along, not someone to fix her life, but someone to sit with her in it. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt like she could breathe again. Margaret woke the following morning with a sense of quiet anticipation. There was no storm outside, no raging clouds or torrential downpour to keep her company. Instead, the sun's early rays filtered softly through the window, casting a gentle warmth on her kitchen. It was a normal morning, and yet, something felt different, like the first morning after a long, dark winter, when the promise of spring begins to feel real. Margaret woke the following morning with a sense of quiet anticipation. There was no storm outside, no raging clouds or torrential downpour to keep her company. Instead, the sun's early rays filtered softly through the window, casting a gentle warmth on her kitchen. It was a normal morning, and yet, something felt different, like the first morning after a long, dark winter, when the promise of spring begins to feel real. She moved through her routine slowly, making coffee and letting the steam fill the space around her. The house, which had once felt empty and cold, now seemed more alive. The small potted plant Sam had brought her the week before was beginning to show signs of life. Its leaves had grown greener, its stem firmer, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret found herself caring for something other than the weight of her own grief. Her thoughts wandered back to Sam, as they often did, and she couldn't help but wonder if the kindness he had shown her was a fluke, a one-time gesture meant to ease her discomfort. But then again, there had been a sincerity in his actions that told her otherwise. He had offered more than just a repair to a sink, he had offered companionship, understanding, and a glimpse of something more. As she sipped her coffee, she heard a car pull up outside. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she thought it was Sam, back again to check on her or offer another small act of kindness. But when she glanced out the window, she saw a different vehicle, a delivery truck with a large package. Curious, she stepped outside and greeted the delivery man, who handed her a box with no return address. It was an odd, unexpected delivery, but there was a familiarity to it. She couldn't put her finger on why, but it felt significant, as though the universe was nudging her toward something. The delivery man simply handed her the box with a polite smile and left without any explanation. Margaret stood there for a moment, turning the box over in her hands, wondering what could possibly be inside. It was heavier than she had anticipated, and the cardboard felt sturdier than normal packaging. With cautious hands, she opened the box. Inside, nestled in layers of protective paper, was a simple wooden frame. A small note was tucked inside it, and as Margaret unfolded it, she read the words written in neat handwriting. "For the memories you're still making. May they bring you peace and light in the days ahead." She felt her chest tighten. The gift was unexpected, but it resonated with a deep part of her. The frame itself was simple, with a light oak finish that wasn't too ornate, but the message had hit her in a way she couldn't have predicted. Her mind raced, wondering who could have sent it, who knew enough about her to understand that she needed something like this, something to hold her memories in a way that wasn't just about mourning the past, but about cherishing it. Before she could overthink it, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Did I miss the delivery?" Margaret turned to see Sam standing in the doorway. His presence felt like a warm breeze on a chilly day, comforting, familiar, and, in some strange way, necessary. He had become such a part of her routine in the last few weeks, though neither of them had spoken of it directly. "You're here," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion she wasn't quite ready to express. "I wasn't expecting you." Sam smiled in that easy way that made Margaret feel seen without feeling judged. "I thought I'd come by and check on you again. I know you've been through a lot, and sometimes, it's just nice to have someone around." She stood still for a moment, unsure of how to respond, before gesturing for him to come inside. "Actually, I received something just now. It's odd." Sam raised an eyebrow as he followed her into the house. He looked down at the wooden frame in her hands, his expression softening. "It's a nice gesture," he said simply. "It's meaningful." Margaret nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the frame. "I don't know who sent it. But it's like they knew I needed something to hold on to, something to remember, but also something that helps me move forward." Sam took a seat at the kitchen table, his gaze thoughtful as he looked at her. "Maybe it's not about letting go of the past. Maybe it's about accepting it, finding a way to live with it without letting it define who you are right now." Margaret sat down across from him, still holding the frame, feeling its weight in her hands. It was like the universe, or fate, or simply the kindness of the people around her, was pushing her to see things differently. She didn't have to forget the past, she just had to learn to let it exist alongside her present. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted, her voice small. "I've spent so long hiding from everything that it's hard to imagine being okay with it." "You don't have to rush it," Sam said, his voice calm and reassuring. "It takes time. But sometimes, it's just about taking small steps, little moments of kindness that remind you that it's okay to feel, to breathe, to let yourself be human again." Margaret looked up at him, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She hadn't expected such clarity from him, and it made something inside her shift. She wasn't alone in this, not truly. Sam had been a part of her life for just a short time, but he had already shown her the power of presence, the comfort that came with someone simply being there, not to fix things but to offer understanding. As the silence stretched between them, Margaret placed the frame on the kitchen counter, her hands trembling slightly. I think I'm ready to start moving forward. Slowly. But forward." Sam's smile was soft, kind. "That's all anyone can do." For the rest of the afternoon, the two of them sat together, talking quietly, sharing the warmth of each other's company. There was no grand revelation, no dramatic change. But for Margaret, that small moment, sitting with someone who truly understood, felt like the first real step toward healing. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like it might hold something good. The weeks that followed were marked by a new sense of purpose for Margaret. The days still passed slowly, but they no longer felt like a series of monotonous steps through an empty house. Sam's visits had become a regular part of her life, and though their time together remained simple, it carried with it a profound sense of peace. He continued to check in, to offer small gestures of kindness, bringing a bouquet of flowers one week, a new book he thought she'd like the next. Each time, Margaret found herself appreciating these quiet moments more than she could have imagined. As the seasons shifted, so too did Margaret. She found herself opening up in ways she hadn't been able to before. The grief that had once consumed her felt more like a part of her life story than something that defined her every waking moment. She had learned that healing wasn't about rushing to move past the pain, but about making space for it while also leaving room for joy, for connection, for new beginnings. One bright Saturday morning, Margaret woke to the sound of birds outside her window, the sunlight streaming in through the curtains. There was a slight chill in the air, but it was the kind of morning that whispered of new possibilities. She made her way to the kitchen, where she had come to enjoy her solitary moments she now shared more freely, even in her own thoughts. A knock at the door interrupted her quiet. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened it, she saw Sam standing on the other side, a large, flat package under his arm. "I thought you might like this," he said with a smile. There was a lightness in his step today, something different in his energy, though Margaret couldn't quite place it. She raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "A little something I thought could brighten your place. I've been working on it for a while, and I think it's about time I bring it over," Sam said with a grin. Margaret opened the door wider to let him inside, intrigued by the mysterious package. "What did you work on?" Sam placed the package on the kitchen table and then stepped back, looking at her with an almost playful expression. "You'll see. Open it." Margaret carefully removed the wrapping, revealing a large canvas painting. It was a simple piece, but it felt incredibly personal, two trees side by side, their branches intertwined, roots digging into the earth below. The painting wasn't detailed or overly complex, but there was something in the way the trees were positioned that made Margaret feel like it was a reflection of her own journey, a reminder that, even through the toughest times, there was still growth, still connection, still life waiting to unfold. Tears welled in her eyes as she stood there, staring at the artwork in awe. "Sam, it's beautiful," she whispered, unable to put into words the depth of her gratitude. "I thought it might speak to you," Sam said gently. "I've been working on it for a while. I know it's been hard for you, Margaret, but you've shown me what it means to keep going, even when it seems impossible. And this is just a small way of saying thank you." Margaret looked up at him, her heart full of emotions she hadn't known she was carrying. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I never knew that kindness like this could change everything." Sam's gaze softened, and for the first time, Margaret saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "Sometimes, all it takes is showing up, you know? We don't have to fix everything, but we can be there for each other. That's enough." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the meaning of his words settle between them. Margaret didn't know what the future held, but in this moment, she knew one thing for certain: life had a way of surprising you, of teaching you to embrace the unexpected. She had spent so long building walls around herself, trying to protect her heart from more hurt. But Sam had shown her that it was okay to open up, to let others in, and to trust that, even when life felt uncertain, there was always room for kindness, for healing, and for hope. As they sat together, sipping tea and talking about nothing and everything, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She wasn't sure where her journey would take her, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone anymore. The weight she had carried for so long felt lighter, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Margaret felt like she could look toward the future without the burden of grief holding her back. And as Sam stood to leave later that afternoon, he looked at her with a final, gentle smile. "Take care of yourself, Margaret. You're stronger than you think." Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Sam. For everything." As he left, the house felt different. It was no longer just a place of memories, it had become a place of healing, a home filled with the quiet hum of connection. Margaret stood by the door, watching as Sam drove away, the painting now a permanent fixture on the wall behind her, a reminder that, in life, sometimes it's the small acts of kindness, the simple moments of connection, that change everything. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more heartwarming stories, motivational journeys, and tales of kindness. Your support means the world to us.